Hello everybody and welcome to another episode. Sorry for being slightly late with this video, but as you can see it was quite a large project and I wanted to get it done. Let's paint loads of tanks. So as mentioned, this week we're going to be having a nice chill session painting loads and loads of tanks. Specifically 7, and they're all based on the Chimera chassis from the Imperial Guard kit. Our armoured force today is 4 Chimeras, 2 Basilisks, and the best Imperial Guard model, a Death Strike. Bringing a tactical nuclear weapon into the battlefields of the 41st millennium seems like a great idea given how horrible everything is already. As you can see, these tanks are in various states of painted and unpainted, some of which are fully painted and will need to be painted over, and some of which are in need of some repair but have been primed, and others that are completely grey plastic, so we have our work cut out for us. The first thing I'm going to do is do a little bit of reparations, starting on the one that needs the most work, this Basilisk, who definitely seems like he's worshipping Khorne when he should be worshipping the Emperor. We're going to take off all these skulls. This was just a process of using my clippers and snapping them off. Luckily it looked like the previous owner had put a bunch of super glue on these, so it was a nice easy thing just to remove them. If they'd used plastic glue, this would be a lot harder. I decided to leave the huge skull that looks like something from a giant on top of the cannon because I felt like it was a nice talking point for the crew. The second Basilisk just needed a little bit of repair on the railings because I'd accidentally snapped it. It came fine, it was a perfect Basilisk beforehand. I also really like the way this thing's painted, but it is not in the scheme that I'm going to end up going for, and the greens would be a bit wild. Next thing was to stack everything on my trusty baking tray and spray them with Governor Green outside. And as you can see after spraying, we have a car park of tanks, but we do need to move because they should not be parking in front of the skips. Bringing everything back inside, we made sure that everything was laid gently down on the table, ready for a bit of drying. I'm quite impressed that nothing chipped with the way I had to transport them, but yeah, sometimes you just get lucky. Now before starting all of the airbrush work, we have to make sure that the ambience is set right, so we turn on our little lamp, which definitely helps with lighting and isn't just to make me feel nice and zen. It's important to feel zen while you paint. Unfortunately, with these guys being unstacked, we've reached the end of the easy part, which is fixing and using a rattle can. Now we have to switch to an airbrush and then get into some actual physical brush work, which is always going to take a while when you have to base coat 7 tanks. Starting with the airbrush, we're going to use a nice pale green. This is Warboss green from Citadel, but you can use any equivalent, and create a nice zenithal on top of the tanks, just to give them a little bit more pop and depth. The airbrush was playing nice today. Sometimes it's a bit of a dick. I'm leaving that in. The airbrush was on form today and made sure I got some nice smooth gradients from the top to the bottom, adding that nice depth that I was after. After this, it was time for some proper brushwork, and I went in with some Black Legion all over the bits that I wanted to be black, which includes, but is not limited to, the huge Death Strike missile, the weapon casings, the weapon shrouds, and a bunch of squadron markings. Now, as mentioned at the top of the video, this is supposed to be a bit of a chill situation, so we're going to listen to some tunes while I finish painting all of the black areas. As mentioned, I was also going to add the squadron markings to the front right-hand side of the vehicles. I'm just doing the one side because I believe that's how the British painted their tanks in the First World War, and I really like that look. So I'm going for black with a white stripe down the centre. The white stripe will be added later. There's a joke about 7 tanks and a 7-nation army, but I'm not going to make it. With all of those black areas done, it's time to move on to all of the metallics, which is going to take some time. I'm using my trusty Vallejo dark aluminium to cover off all the tracks, all the weapons, all the comms gear, probably a few other bits, and we're going to speed through this bit too because it took quite some time. It is worth noting that whilst I normally paint my tracks in a brown colour, I used metallics this time because the Mournfang brown I usually use is running out and I didn't realise, so we're going to add a little bit of that later. With the slightly more boring colours now done, we can move on to some nice reds. I'm going to use this for all of the lenses and all of the missile tips on the Hunter Killers and that huge Deathstrike nuclear warhead thing that I love so very much. As well as adding all those lovely red colours to the missile tips and lenses, which I think really helps the models pop, we started moving into a few smaller areas, specifically the leather parts of those exposed crewmen and tank commanders. This is also important because I almost forgot them, so I had to run back and do this. Don't forget your little men, they're just as important as the tanks themselves. And after I'd base coated all of those areas, I also added that squadron stripe. Painting white over black is normally a massive pain, but I'm using pale grey blue from Vallejo, which I have recommended countless times and recommend yet again to do stuff like this. It's a couple of coats rather than a million, and I really like it for doing squadron markings like this. Plus it covers really nicely, not like those nasty GW white paints. One thing I added to the front of the two Chimeras with the dozer blades was another squadron marking on the opposite side. I thought this would help break up that big green lump on the front of the tank, and I think it worked. When we come to the weathering stage, it's going to look even better. After finishing off the white stripes on the squadron markings, I went to base coat the guardsmen's faces in the same colour. That means I can cover them later with Guilliman Flesh contrast paint and add a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade under the eyes and have them done really quickly. Now onto the super fun part of painting tanks, all of the weathering. In my usual method, I'm going to use Rhinox hide as the base layer for the chipping, and I'm going to use a sponge held between two tweezers clipped together with a butterfly clip. This just means that you're not going to be tiring out your hands if you're doing this on, say, more than one vehicle. Maybe, I don't know, if you're doing 7 tanks. We're going for a pretty rough and ready look on these tanks. They've been in the field for some time, so you don't need to be too careful or too particular where you stab these chips down. My general advice would be go for those sharp edges, go for the corners, go for areas you think that the most wear would appear, and most importantly, don't have too much paint on your sponge, otherwise it will splatter everywhere, including places you don't want it to be. One area to take care around is the crewmen themselves. We don't want them to have chipping on them. Fabric doesn't work that way, it won't have chipping. Different if they're wearing armour, you can absolutely chip that, but in this case, just try and avoid them as best you can. If you make a mistake, just go back in with your base colour and tidy it up. After all the Rhinox hide areas were done, I went in with the same method but using a light green to make it look like a bit of paint was chipping off. Chipped paint always looks slightly lighter than the base coat, so this adds a nice 3D effect to our chipping without too much effort. Also, if we target correctly, it's going to look like a good highlight for us. I did the exact same thing with Dawnstone over the black areas once the green was done. It's worth mentioning that after this, off camera, I did highlight all of the guardsmen's uniforms, but you won't see it because I didn't think it was worth filming. That, and if you've watched any of my videos, you've probably seen hundreds of guardsmen getting highlighted, so I'll link one of those in the top right now. After all the chipping was complete, we're moving on to one of my favourite techniques, and that's adding some streaks. Using Agaros Dunes contrast paint and a sharp brush, I made sure there was plenty of grease and oil dripping down off of a few key areas. This is such an easy way to add more depth, definition and character to your tanks. You can start these from any recess you'd like, but if you use nuts, bolts, washers, things where water would pool and drip down, you're generally going to have a really nice effect. I also use this to break up any large flat panels like the dozer blade on the front, just to add a bit more visual interest. You can also do this in as many colours as you like. I'm using quite a greasy looking colour here, but you can also use reds to simulate rust, some browns to simulate older rust. You can use purples. I mean, I can't think what would be purple, but I know it would look super cool and wouldn't look too out of place on a green tank. I'm also going to go in with some wildwood to add a few darker areas to these streaks. Variation is great, but all I would say is probably on a miniature this size, stick to 2 or 3 maximum. If you go for too many colours, it might start to look a little bit messy and your eye can't pick out all of the detail. Now that we're complete with 90% of the weathering, we're going to go into those areas that we didn't want to have chipping or streaking on. Now we've done those, we know that these areas that we're painting next won't get messy from those processes. So I'm talking about things like bed rolls, any soft stowage that you didn't want to be chipped or dirty, and also all those areas on the guardsmen that I mentioned earlier where they needed some highlights or some extra base colours put in. I also love painting these little cups on the side of the basilisk. I added a red rim to the top of the cup later because it makes it look like a nice enamel cup, which I really like. I also took this moment to add the highlights to all of the lenses using Evil Sun Scarlet and a little dot of white paint in the top right corner to add a specular highlight. One thing I really liked about these models is that they had quite a bit of character already, especially this basilisk with the little range flag on the back, so I added a little diamond where the old transfer used to be because I wanted to keep that from before. I do really enjoy things like this on secondhand models, so if you can keep them alive and keep the story going, then absolutely do so. As we're speaking of models that are second-hand and have a little bit of character to them, we're going to quickly switch back to the other basilisk and paint the cool monster skull that's on top of the cannon. Still really like this. I think it gives it so much personality. You bet the crew are proud of that. Moving on to a few final details, I added in some Rune Lord brass all over the ammunition that was exposed on the stubber and a few other ammo cans, and added yellow to the searchlights on the two chimeras that had them. Now we're on to our few final bits of weathering. We're going to add some Seraphim Sepia, Agrax Earthshade, and then Druchii Violet, all of the flamers and those weapons that are going to get hot. I think it looks cool on stubbers too, because if they're firing sustained burst, the barrel can get red hot. Next up, using my limited supply of Mournfang Brown and a healthy amount of water, I added a rust effect all over our nice clean tracks. It's also worth mentioning that off camera I'd covered everything in Nuln Oil. I didn't feel like you needed to see that because it's just slapping Nuln Oil on. After adding all the Mournfang Brown, I also added a little bit of Wild Rider Red to add a little bit of differentiation to the rust. The final step after this was taking some dark earth from Vallejo and a really old crusty brush and stabbing it on all over the tracks and in those areas where mud gets thrown up. So focusing round towards the back end of the tank where the tracks are rolling forward and flinging the mud onto the compartment. And with that, that's 7 tanks complete. I'm not going to lie and say it was one sitting, it took me a couple of days, and that's one of the reasons that this video is slightly late. Apologies, we'll be back to our normal viewing schedule in the very near future. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been Sam, see you next time.